Detective Sherman, the Ponderosa Execution, unveiling the Frankline content warning. This story contains graphic descriptions of violence, murder, and drug-related crime. It is only suitable for viewers 18 years and older. All names have been changed to protect identities. The events described are based on a real case, but details may have been altered for legal and privacy reasons. Legal disclaimer. This content is provided for educational and informational purposes only. No part of this narrative should be interpreted as encouraging criminal behavior. The views expressed are solely those of Detective Sherman and do not represent legal advice or official police statements. The call that started it all. I remember the call like it was yesterday. It was 3:27 a.m., and the March wind was howling outside my apartment window when my phone lit up the darkness. My name is Detective Sherman, and I specialize in cases that leave others sleepless, the ones that make even veteran officers turn away. This was about to become one of them. "Sherman," I answered, voice still thick with sleep. The dispatcher's words came through clear and urgent. Body at Ponderosa Park. Multiple stab wounds. Looks like an execution. By the time I arrived at the scene, the first light of dawn was struggling to break through Sheffield's perpetually gray sky. The body was still there, lying in an awkward position on wet grass, surrounded by evidence markers that glowed like fireflies in the morning mist. I'd seen many crime scenes in my 23 years as a detective, but something about this one sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the March temperature. 16 stab wounds, the medical examiner told me, pulling back the sheet just enough for me to see the victim's face. Severed femoral artery. He bled out in minutes. The victim was a young man, mid-20s, South Asian descent. His name was Kareem Adams, though I would later learn he went by the street name Phantom in certain circles. As I stood over his body, I couldn't help but wonder, what kind of rage drives someone to stab another human being 16 times? This wasn't just murder, it was a message written in blood. What I didn't know then, as I surveyed the silent park with its backdrop of tower blocks and concrete walkways, was that this case would unravel a drug empire built on the backs of children. It would expose a system so calculated and cruel that it would change how I viewed organized crime forever. And it would start with 3 names: Trent Wilson, Mason Kelly, and Vanessa Roberts. If you're watching this now, I invite you to step into my shoes. Put yourself in the position of a detective facing a brutal killing orchestrated by teenagers. What would you do first? Who would you trust? The answers aren't as straightforward as you might think. The city of steel and shadows. Sheffield, a city built on steel, now forged in something far more sinister. Once the industrial heart of northern England, its factories had fallen silent years ago, replaced by a different kind of industry, one that thrived in the shadows of those abandoned warehouses and forgotten estates. I've worked in this city for 2 decades, watched it transform, seen neighborhoods rise and fall, but in recent years, something has shifted dramatically. The traditional gangs with their territories and codes had been replaced by something more insidious. County lines drug operations, named after famous boxers, run with corporate efficiency and powered by children too young to even drive. The Frank line is the worst of them, Detective Inspector Monroe told me as we drove through the streets surrounding Ponderosa Park. They've got zones mapped out like a business plan. Cross into their territory and you might as well sign your death warrant. The Frank line, named after a heavyweight boxing champion, was just one of several drug networks that had sprung up across Sheffield and its surrounding areas. Others included the Bruno line and the AJ line, each competing for dominance in a city where poverty and desperation created perfect conditions for their business to flourish. And our victim? I asked, watching the rain-slicked streets pass by outside the window. Kareem Adams, 24 years old, local dealer, been operating in the area for about 6 months. Word on the street is that he was selling on Frank line territory without kicking up to their bosses. That was the first piece of the puzzle. Kareem hadn't just been murdered, he'd been punished. And punishments in this world were designed to send messages. As we pulled up outside a towering block of flats in the Netherthorpe area, Monroe pointed to a third-floor window. That's where he was before he got the call. Friend's place. Guy's bedridden. Couldn't tell us much except that Kareem left around 4 a.m., saying he'd be right back. I stared up at the window, trying to imagine Kareem's final moments alive, walking out that door, unaware that he was heading to his execution. What was going through his mind? Was it just another drug deal? Did he have any inkling of what was waiting for him in the darkness of Ponderosa Park? One more thing, Monroe added, turning to face me. There's CCTV footage from a building overlooking part of the park. It's grainy, but it shows 3 figures, 1 female, 2 males. The males appear to be teenagers. Teenagers? The word hung in the air between us. The Frank line was known for recruiting young boys looking for belonging, for status, for money, in a city that offered little of any of these things. But murder? That was crossing a line even by their standards. I need to see that footage, I said. Have you ever watched death unfold in grainy black and white? I have, more times than I care to count. But this time was different. As we reviewed the CCTV footage in the station's cramped viewing room, I felt a heaviness settle over me that I couldn't shake. The timestamp read 04:17 a.m. A lone figure named Kareem entered the frame, moving with purpose across the edge of the park. 3 minutes later, a woman approached from the opposite direction. They met, appeared to exchange words. Nothing seemed amiss. Then suddenly, from outside the frame, 2 hooded figures rushed in. The attack was swift, brutal, coordinated. Kareem tried to back away and seemed to pull something from his pocket, likely his own knife, but he was overwhelmed quickly. "Stop it there," I said, pointing to a frame where the woman was visible. She wasn't participating in the attack, but she wasn't running either. She was watching, standing about 30 meters away. "Who is she?" Monroe shrugged. "Working on ID. But looking at her body language, she's not surprised. This wasn't random." I nodded slowly. "She's the bait. She lured him there." As the footage continued, we watched Kareem collapse. The 2 attackers fled quickly, but not in panic. They moved with the confidence of people who believed they'd done their job and done it well. The woman lingered for a moment, then walked away in a different direction. "Run facial recognition on all 3, I instructed, "and get me everything we have on Frank line operations in the last 6 months. Arrests, surveillance, informant reports, everything." "Already on it," Monroe replied. "But Sherman, you should know something else." The night shift picked up chatter that this hit was ordered from the top. This wasn't some street-level beef. Someone important wanted Kareem gone. I thought about what that meant, that somewhere in this city, Someone had sat in comfort and safety and ordered the death of a young man, and they had used children to carry it out. It made my blood boil. "Then let's work our way up the ladder," I said, rewinding the footage to watch it one more time, starting with identifying our 3 killers. If you were sitting where I was, watching those grainy images of life being violently taken, what would you focus on first? The killers? The victim? The woman who set it all up? In cases like these, every detail matters, and often it's the smallest ones that break everything open. Within 48 hours, we had names for all 3 suspects. The facial recognition system flagged the 2 males as Trent Wilson, 17, and Mason Kelly, 16. Both were local boys with minimal prior records. Trent had none at all, while Mason had a conditional caution for possession with intent to supply cannabis. The woman was identified as Vanessa Roberts, 25, known to police as a sex worker with a heavy drug habit. What struck me immediately was how young the boys were, just children, really. I'd spent years working juvenile cases before moving to homicide, and I knew better than most how gangs targeted vulnerable kids. But something about seeing these baby-faced killers on my murder board made my stomach turn. What do we know about their connections to the Frank line? I asked Monroe as we stood in the incident room, surrounded by photos and timelines. "Confirmed foot soldiers," she replied, pulling up their files on her tablet. "They patrol the Ponderosa area, enforce territory boundaries, and make collections. But neither has violent priors. This is a serious escalation. And Roberts, no direct gang affiliation that we can find. She buys regularly from Frank line dealers, sometimes trades sexual services for drugs. But she's not on their payroll as far as we can tell." I studied her picture of a thin face with hollow eyes, the kind of expression I'd seen countless times in people whose lives had been consumed by addiction. So what's her role in this? Why would she help set up Kareem? Monroe shrugged. Drugs? Money? Protection? Could be any of those or all of them. I nodded slowly. We need to find them before they disappear. Put out alerts to all uniforms. Check known addresses, associates, anywhere they might hide. But as it turned out, finding them was easier than expected. On Tuesday morning, just 3 days after the murder, Trent Wilson and Mason Kelly walked into Shepcote Lane Police Station and turned themselves in. "They just showed up?" I asked incredulously when Monroe called me. "Walked right through the front door at 9:30 this morning. Didn't say much, just that they wanted to talk about what happened at Ponderosa Park." It was unusual, to say the least. Most killers don't volunteer themselves to police, especially not teenagers who had committed such a brutal crime. Something wasn't adding up. By the time I arrived at the station, both boys were in separate interview rooms. I decided to observe Trent's interview first, watching through the 2-way mirror, as Detective Carson took the lead. Trent Wilson looked smaller in person than in his photo's hunched shoulders, hands fidgeting beneath the table, eyes darting around the room. He looked like what he was, a scared kid. But I reminded myself that this scared kid had plunged a knife into another human being multiple times just days ago. Interview commencing at 11:07 a.m. with Trent Wilson regarding the death of Kareem Adams, Carson began formally. "Trent, you came in voluntarily today. Can you tell us why?" Trent looked directly at the recorder, then at Carson, his face a blank mask. No comment. And that's how it continued, question after question, met with the same 2 words, no comment. Someone had coached him well. He didn't ask for a lawyer, which told me he'd been instructed not to, probably to avoid any appearance of gang connections. But his silence spoke volumes. Mason Kelly's interview went exactly the same way. 2 teenagers, both refusing to speak, both clearly following instructions. Someone got to them, I told Monroe as we regrouped afterward. Someone told them to turn themselves in but keep their mouths shut. The question is why, Monroe replied. Why would the Frank line want their soldiers to surrender? I had a theory forming, but I needed more pieces. What about Roberts? Any sign of her? Nothing yet. We've checked her known addresses, usual haunts. She's gone to ground, but Vanessa Roberts couldn't hide forever. By that evening, officers located her in the Burngreave area of Sheffield. When approached, she initially gave a false name, Laura Smith, but one of the arresting officers had her mug shot on his phone. The game was up. Unlike the boys, Roberts wasn't disciplined enough to stay silent. Within hours of her arrest, prison staff reported overhearing her in the showers, laughing with another inmate about how she was going to play the mental health card and claiming that her boys had stabbed Kareem because he was on their turf. It was our first real break, a confession of sorts, though inadmissible in court. But it confirmed what we already suspected. Kareem Adams had been killed for selling drugs on Frank Line territory, and Roberts had played a role in setting him up. All 3 were formally charged with murder, but I still had nagging questions. Why would 2 teenagers with minimal records suddenly commit such a brutal killing? Who had ordered the hit? And why had they turned themselves in? To find those answers, I needed to go deeper into the Frank Line's operations. I needed to find the puppet masters pulling the strings behind Trent, Mason, and Vanessa. Let me ask you something. If you were investigating this case, where would you look next? The kids who did the killing or the adults who sent them to do it? Sometimes in detective work, the most obvious path isn't the one that leads to the truth. The setup. To understand what happened to Kareem Adams, I needed to understand the hours leading up to his death. Through witness statements, CCTV footage, and phone records, I began to piece together the events of that night. It started at a flat in Spring Walk, belonging to an elderly bedridden man known only as Mr. H in our reports. His home had become an unofficial base for local dealers, a convenient location where the owner was physically incapable of interfering or reporting activities. On the night of March 8, 2024, Trent Wilson, Mason Kelly, and Vanessa Roberts were all present at Mr. H's flat. Several witnesses confirmed seeing them arrive together around 10 p.m. What happened next was pieced together from fragmented accounts, but the picture that emerged was chilling. According to a neighbor who overheard parts of their conversation through the thin walls, there was talk about someone stepping on toes and needing to send a message. Phone records showed that Roberts received a call at 11:42 p.m. from a burner phone that we later traced to a higher-ranking member of the Frank Line, still unidentified at this point in our investigation. Whatever was said in that call, it set things in motion. I explained to my team during our morning briefing a week after the murder. Because right after that, Roberts, Wilson, and Kelly started planning. By midnight, they had formulated their plan. Roberts would call Kareem, who had sold her drugs before, and arranged to meet him under the pretense of buying more. She would suggest Ponderosa Park Frank Line territory as the meeting point and hint at the possibility of sexual services in exchange for drugs. It was the perfect lure, Monroe noted grimly. A regular customer who also happens to be a sex worker suggesting a late-night meet. Kareem wouldn't suspect a thing. The trio left Mr. H's flat around 1 a.m. CCTV footage tracked them to a nearby convenience store where Wilson and Kelly purchased energy drinks and cigarettes. They then separated, Roberts returning to her own flat to wait, while the boys went to an address associated with Frank Line activities. At 3:48 a.m., Roberts made the call to Kareem. Phone records confirmed a 4-minute conversation in which she asked him to meet her at Ponderosa Park. By this point, Wilson and Kelly were already in position, hidden in the shadows near a footpath that cut through the park. What happened next was captured partially on CCTV and filled in by forensic evidence. Kareem arrived at approximately 4:17 a.m. He met Roberts on the path, and they appeared to have a brief conversation. Then Wilson and Kelly emerged from hiding, armed with what the medical examiner later described as machete-like blades. Kareem saw them coming. He backed away, pulling out his own knife and a large folding blade in self-defense. Witnesses in nearby flats reported hearing shouting, with one distinctly remembering a man's voice calling out, "Just leave it." Then came the sounds of the attack itself. The forensic evidence told the rest of the story. 16 stab wounds, concentrated on Kareem's torso and upper legs. One severed his femoral artery, causing catastrophic blood loss. He collapsed, but attempted to rise again before falling for the final time. By the time emergency services arrived at 4:55 a.m., responding to a 999 call from a nearby resident, Kareem Adams was beyond saving. "So we have the who, the how, and the what," I said, standing in front of our murder board. "But I'm still not satisfied with why. Yes, Kareem was dealing on their turf, but this level of violence suggests something more personal." That's when a junior officer, Constable Patel, raised her hand. "Sir, I might have something. I've been going through Kareem's phone records from the past month, and I found multiple calls to a number associated with a known Bruno Line operative. The Bruno Line, the Frank Line's main competitor in Sheffield." Suddenly, the pieces started falling into place. "He wasn't just dealing on their territory," I said slowly, the realization dawning on me. "He was dealing with the competition. This wasn't just about territory. It was about sending a message in a turf war. And using teenagers to send it," Monroe added grimly. "Because if they get caught, they face juvenile sentences," I finished, "while the real shot callers stay hidden and protected. It was a cold, calculating system designed to shield those at the top while exploiting those at the bottom. And Kareem Adams had paid the ultimate price for getting caught in the middle. But something still bothered me. Why had Wilson and Kelly turned themselves in so quickly? It wasn't typical gang behavior, especially for a crime this serious. Unless they were ordered to," I said suddenly. "Think about it. If they're arrested while running, it looks like gang activity. If they turn themselves in, stay silent. It looks more like a personal dispute gone wrong. The Frank Line stays further in the shadows." "And Roberts?" Monroe asked. "She wasn't part of that plan. She's the loose end." I turned to the team. "We need protective measures for Roberts immediately. If I'm right, she's in danger from her own people. Have you ever realized that what looks like surrender might actually be a strategy? That's why we were facing a calculated move designed to protect the organization at the expense of its foot soldiers. The question was, could we use that same calculation against them?" The trial, the legal proceedings moved with unusual speed a marker of both the strength of our evidence and the political pressure to resolve a high-profile murder case involving teenage killers. By May 24, 2024, just over 2 months after Kareem's murder, Trent Wilson and Mason Kelly appeared in Sheffield Crown Court. I sat in the back row of the courtroom watching as they entered, both wearing suits that didn't quite fit, both looking somehow younger than their ages in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Their families were absent, I noticed. No parents to stand by them in their moment of judgment. It spoke volumes about the isolation that had likely pushed them into the arms of the Frank line in the first place. To everyone's surprise, both boys pleaded guilty not just to murder, but also to possession of bladed weapons. No attempts to minimize their roles, no claims of diminished responsibility. Just two teenagers admitting to killing a man in cold blood. Their legal strategy became clear immediately. Sacrifice the foot soldiers to protect the generals. By pleading guilty, they eliminated the need for a trial that might expose more details about the Frank line's operations. It was the final service they could perform for their masters. Vanessa Roberts, however, had other ideas. When brought before the same court, she pleaded not guilty, claiming she had no knowledge that Wilson and Kelly intended to kill Kareem. She admitted to calling him and arranging the meeting, but insisted she thought it was just for a drug deal. Her trial began on October 28, 2024, and I attended every day, watching as the prosecution methodically dismantled her defense. They presented CCTV evidence showing her at Mr. H's flat with Wilson and Kelly hours before the murder. They played recordings of her prison conversations where she had bragged about setting up the whole thing. They called witnesses who testified to her connections to the Frank line. Most damning of all was the testimony of a fellow drug user whom Roberts had visited immediately after the murder. According to this witness, Roberts had arrived agitated, high, and boastful, declaring that she had set the whole thing up to protect Frank line territory, and that now everyone will know not to mess with us. Throughout the trial, Roberts sat impassively, occasionally whispering to her counsel, but showing little emotion as the evidence mounted against her. I watched her carefully, trying to understand what had brought a 25-year-old woman to participate in such a brutal crime. Was it drugs? Fear? A misguided attempt at loyalty to people who saw her as nothing more than a tool? On the 5th day of the trial, I received a call that changed everything about two names that had been circling the periphery of our investigation for months. Tyler Johnson and Marcus Wright, both 23, suspected to be mid-level managers in the Frank line's operation. "We've got them," Monroe said breathlessly over the phone. "The regional organized crime unit just picked them up in a series of coordinated raids. 10 properties hit simultaneously across Burton-on-Trent and surrounding areas. They found burner phones, drug caches, and detailed records of County Lines operations. It was a major breakthrough, not just for Kareem's case, but for our understanding of how the Frank line operated. And it came just as Robert's trial was reaching its conclusion. While I couldn't share this information with the court, I sat there on November 11, 2024, with a grim satisfaction as the jury returned after less than 4 hours of deliberation. Their verdict: guilty. Vanessa Roberts had played her part in Kareem Adams' death, and now she would face the consequences. On November 28th, all 3 defendants stood before Judge Jeremy Richardson, KC, for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with local press, police officers who had worked the case, and in the front row, Kareem's family, holding on to each other as they prepared to hear the final act in their loved one's tragic story. Judge Richardson addressed each defendant in turn, his voice resonating with contained anger as he detailed their crimes. To Wilson, now 18, he was assigned a detention at His Majesty's pleasure, the juvenile equivalent of a life sentence with a minimum term of 16 years. Kelly, still only 17, received the same sentence with a minimum of 15 years. And Roberts, for her role in setting the trap, was given life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years before she could be considered for parole. This case, Judge Richardson declared, looking not just at the defendants, but at the entire courtroom, represents a failure of our society, a failure to protect young people from the predatory grasp of drug gangs, a failure to provide alternatives to those who see no future beyond the temporary status and income that crime provides, and ultimately, a failure to prevent the senseless loss of a young man's life. As the defendants were led away, I watched Kareem's mother collapse into tears, her husband's arm tight around her shoulders. Justice had been served, but it could never return their son to them. It could never heal the wound that his murder had torn in their lives. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around shouting questions about the case, about the sentences, about what this meant for drug crime in Sheffield. But my mind was already elsewhere on the raids that had nabbed Johnson and Wright, and on what those raids might reveal about the true power structure behind the Frank line. Because while Wilson, Kelly, and Roberts would serve their time, the real architects of Kareem's death were still out there, and I was determined to find them. If you've ever lost someone to violence, you know that a conviction doesn't bring closure. It just brings a different phase of grief. For Kareem's family, the sentencing wasn't an ending, but a painful milestone on a journey they never asked to take. And for me, it was just the beginning of a deeper investigation. The Puppet Masters. The sentencing of Wilson, Kelly, and Roberts should have felt like a victory. 3 killers behind bars. Justice served for Kareem Adams and his family. But as I drove home from the courthouse that evening, I felt hollow, because I knew what most people didn't. We had only caught the puppets, not the puppet masters. 2 weeks after the sentencing, I found myself in an unmarked police car driving to a secure facility outside Sheffield. Beside me was D.I. Monroe, and in the back seat, a stack of files containing the preliminary findings from the raids that had captured Tyler Johnson and Marcus Wright. What we found in those properties goes way beyond Kareem's murder, Monroe said, flipping through one of the files. It's the entire operational structure of not just the Frank line, but the Bruno line and AJ line as well. Recruitment methods, territory maps, payment systems, everything. The facility we were headed to was where Johnson and Wright were being held pending their trial for conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. After months of building our case, I had finally been granted permission to interview them not about drug offenses, but about murder. Tyler Johnson was brought into the interview room first. He didn't look like my mental image of a drug lord, slim, medium height, with the kind of face that would blend into any crowd, but his eyes gave him away cold, calculating, constantly assessing. Mr. Johnson, I began after the formal introductions and cautions, I'm here to talk to you about Kareem Adams. He raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing. We know that Kareem was killed for selling drugs on Frank Line territory. We know that Trent Wilson and Mason Kelly carried out the killing, and Vanessa Roberts helped set it up. What we don't know is who gave the order. Johnson smiled slightly. Can't help you, Detective. Never heard of any of those people. That's interesting, I replied, opening a file in front of me, because we found this in your apartment. I slid a photo across the table, a screenshot from a deleted messaging app reconstructed by our tech team. It showed a conversation between Johnson and an unknown contact, dated March 7th, 2024. Phantom problem needs handling. Getting too comfortable on the west side. Send a message. Phantom, I said, watching his face carefully. That was Kareem Adams' street name. And the next day, he was dead. Stabbed 16 times in Ponderosa Park, the west side of your territory. Johnson's smile didn't falter, but I noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. Lots of people called Phantom out there, Detective, and that message could mean anything. Maybe. But when we couple it with testimony from Roberts about receiving instructions from a burner phone registered to you, and with phone records showing calls between you and Wilson immediately before and after the murder, it starts to look a lot like conspiracy to murder. That got his attention. His eyes narrowed slightly. Roberts is talking? I let the question hang in the air, neither confirming nor denying. In truth, Roberts hadn't given us anything useful yet, but Johnson didn't need to know that. Here's what I think happened, I continued. Kareem was selling on your turf, maybe even working for the Bruno line. You decided to make an example of him, but you were smart enough not to get your hands dirty. So you used kids Wilson and Kelly to do your dirty work. Young enough to get lighter sentences if caught, disposable enough that their loss wouldn't impact your operations. Johnson leaned back, his expression unreadable. Nice story, Detective, but it's just that. I run a legitimate business in Burton-on-Trent. Whatever else you think I'm involved in is your imagination. A legitimate business that somehow requires 15 burner phones and $20,000 worth of cocaine and heroin in your home? He shrugged. Those aren't mine. As my lawyer will explain at trial, I changed tack. Tell me about the Frank line. Why name your operation after a boxer? Again, Detective, I don't know what you're talking about, but I could see it in his eyes, the calculation, the weighing of options. Johnson was smart, careful. He wouldn't break easily, but he wasn't the only one we had in custody. Marcus Wright proved more illuminating, though not in the way I expected. Younger than Johnson, with a nervous energy that manifested in constantly moving hands, Wright had been caught with more direct evidence linking him to drug operations. I didn't have anything to do with any murder, he insisted as soon as I mentioned Kareem's name. That was Tyler's call, not mine. It was the first crack, the first direct attribution of responsibility. I kept my expression neutral, not wanting to show my excitement at this slip. Tyler Johnson ordered the hit on Kareem Adams? I asked, seeking explicit confirmation. Wright seemed to realize his mistake. He backtracked quickly. I didn't say that. I don't know anything about any murder, but the damage was done. He had placed Johnson at the center of the decision to kill Kareem, and now it was just a matter of building the case methodically, piece by piece. Over the following weeks, our team worked tirelessly, correlating evidence from the raids with the murder investigation. We mapped phone connections, analyzed financial transactions, and interviewed lower-level dealers who had been swept up in the raids. Slowly, a clear picture emerged. The Frank line wasn't just a drug distribution network. It was a highly organized criminal enterprise with a rigid, hierarchical structure. At the bottom were runners, usually children as young as 14, recruited from broken homes or care facilities, promised money, status, and belonging. Above them were enforcers like Wilson and Kelly, responsible for maintaining territory and discipline. Then came managers like Johnson and Wright, who oversaw operations across multiple areas. But there was still a level above them, the true architects, who kept themselves removed from day-to-day operations. And as we dug deeper, two more names surfaced repeatedly: Leonard Mathers and Vincent Cole, both in their early 30s, both with no criminal records, but substantial unexplained wealth. They're the real targets, I told Monroe as we updated our investigation board. Johnson and Wright are just middle management. Mathers and Cole are the ones building this system that exploits children and leaves bodies in its wake. Can we get to them? She asked, studying the limited information we had on the two men. I nodded slowly. With Johnson looking at potential murder charges on top of the drug trafficking, he might be willing to deal. We offer reduced charges in exchange for testimony against Mathers and Cole. It was a gamble, but one worth taking. The following day, I returned to the secure facility where Johnson was being held. This time, he had his lawyer present a sleek, expensive-looking woman in a perfectly tailored suit. My client has nothing to say about any murder, she began before I had even sat down. That's unfortunate, I replied calmly, because we have enough to charge him with conspiracy to murder in the death of Kareem Adams. That's a life sentence, Ms. Harrington, on top of the drug trafficking charges he's already facing. I laid out the evidence we had accumulated, the messages, the phone records, Wright's slip-up, testimony from lower-level dealers. Individually, each piece might not be conclusive, but together they painted a damning picture. However, I continued, we're prepared to be reasonable. If Mr. Johnson can provide substantial assistance regarding the leadership and operations of the Frank line, specifically including information about Leonard Mathers and Vincent Cole, the Crown Prosecution Service might view that favorably when considering charges. Johnson and his lawyer exchanged glances. I could almost see the calculations happening behind their eyes, weighing years in prison against the danger of betraying even more dangerous men. We need assurances, the lawyer said finally. Written guarantees about reduced charges and protection? I can arrange that, I replied, feeling the first stirrings of something like victory. But we need everything. The whole operation, top to bottom, names, dates, methods, and specific information about who ordered Kareem Adams' murder and why. Johnson leaned forward slightly. And if I do this, if I tell you everything, what happens to me afterward? Mathers and Cole aren't the kind of men who forgive betrayal. It was a valid concern. The men at the top of organizations like the Frank line didn't achieve that position by being merciful to those who crossed them. Witness protection, I said. A new identity, a new location. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better than spending the rest of your life in prison. 3 days later, Johnson signed a formal agreement with the Crown Prosecution Service. In exchange for his testimony against Mathers, Cole, and others in the Frank line hierarchy, he would receive reduced charges and consideration at sentencing, along with entry into the Witness Protection Program. His statement, given over 2 days of intensive interviews, provided a comprehensive look inside the Frank line's operations. How they recruited vulnerable children, how they moved drugs across county lines, and how they enforced their territory through calculated violence. And finally, He confirmed what we had suspected all along. The order to kill Kareem Adams had come directly from Vincent Cole, transmitted through the chain of command to Johnson, who had selected Wilson and Kelly for the job and instructed Roberts to set the trap. Cole wanted it to be brutal, Johnson told us. He said Kareem needed to be an example. That's why it wasn't just a shooting or a quick stabbing. It had to be excessive, something that would send a message to anyone else thinking about selling on our turf, especially Bruno Line Associates. Armed with Johnson's testimony and the mountain of evidence gathered from the raids, he moved against Mathers and Cole in April, arresting both men in coordinated dawn raids at their respective homes and substantial properties in affluent areas far from the urban neighborhoods where their drugs were sold. The case against them was solid, built on financial records, phone data, witness testimony, and the direct evidence provided by Johnson. In October 2024, both men were convicted of multiple charges, including conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, directing a criminal organization, and in Cole's case, conspiracy to murder. Leonard Mathers was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Vincent Cole received 18 years for his role in orchestrating Kareem Adams' murder. As I watched them being led from the courtroom by these men who had built an empire on the exploitation of children and the destruction of communities, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. We had dismantled a significant criminal network and brought Kareem's killers to justice. But at what cost? 3 young lives, Wilson, Kelly, and Roberts, effectively ended before they had really begun. A family left grieving for their murdered son. Countless children pulled into county lines operations, their futures derailed. The Frank line was broken, but I had no illusions another would rise to take its place. The conditions that created it still existed: poverty, lack of opportunity, broken systems of care and support. As long as those remained, there would always be men like Mathers and Cole ready to exploit them. Have you ever solved a problem only to realize that the real problem runs much deeper? That's what haunts me about this case. We caught the killers. We caught their bosses. We even caught the men at the top of the pyramid. But the system that created them, that remains untouched, ready to produce the next generation of victims and perpetrators. The aftermath. 6 months after the sentencing of Mathers and Cole, I found myself standing outside HMP Doncaster on a cold morning, waiting for a meeting I had requested weeks earlier. The prison gates opened, and I was led through a series of security checks before being taken to a small, bare interview room. Vanessa Roberts was brought in, wearing standard-issue prison clothing, her hair pulled back severely from a face that seemed to have aged years in just months. She looked surprised to see that we hadn't spoken since her trial. "Detective Shernan," she said, as she sat down across from me. "Didn't expect to see you again. I wanted to follow up," I replied, "to let you know that we got all of them. Johnson, Wright, Mathers, Cole. The whole Frank line operation has been dismantled." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "It's a bit late for me, isn't it?" "I'm not here to offer false comfort, Ms. Roberts. You're serving a life sentence for your role in Kareem's death, and that's appropriate. But I wanted to understand something that's been bothering me since the beginning. Why? Why did you set him up?" Roberts was silent for a long moment, staring at her hands on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, emotionless. "I owed them. I'd been fronted for drugs worth thousands, and I couldn't pay. Johnson said I could clear my debt by doing one thing for him: getting Kareem to Ponderosa that night. She looked up at me. I knew they were going to hurt him. I didn't know they were going to kill him. Not at first. But you realized it before you made that call, I said. It wasn't a question. She nodded slowly. Yeah, I heard Wilson and Kelly talking at Mr. H's flat. They had knives. They were talking about where to stab him for maximum damage. Her voice cracked slightly. I could have backed out. I could have warned him. But I was scared, and I was high, and I needed my debt cleared. So you made the call. So I made the call. She repeated, a hollow echo. And now I'll spend at least 15 years here thinking about it. I studied her face, trying to understand the complex web of addiction, fear, and self-interest that had led her to participate in murder. What about Wilson and Kelly? Did you know them well? Not really. Just kids from the estate. Kelly was still in school, for God's sake. She shook her head. The Frank line was always recruiting young people hanging around outside schools, youth clubs, offering them jobs as lookouts first, then moving them up. The younger they were, the more loyal they'd be. It was a pattern we'd seen repeatedly in our investigation. The deliberate targeting of children, especially those from troubled backgrounds or care homes. The Frank line had operated like a dark mirror of social services, finding vulnerable kids that the system had failed and offering them what looked like opportunity, but was really exploitation. I've been wondering, I said, if you could go back to the night before Kareem's murder, would you make different choices? Roberts looked at me for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above us. Everyone in prison says they'd choose differently if they could go back. Easy to say that now. But that night, high as a kite, owing money to people who'd hurt me if I didn't pay, scared out of my mind. She shook her head. I'd like to think I'd be brave enough to say no, to warn Kareem, but I don't know. Her honesty was brutal, but refreshing. No excuses, no attempts to minimize her responsibility. Just the raw acknowledgement of the choices she had made and the person she had been. What happens to the kids now? She asked suddenly. The ones who were in the Frank line? Now that it's gone? It was a good question, one that had been preoccupying me as well. Some are in secure facilities or youth offender institutions. Others are being worked with by social services, trying to reintegrate them into education or training. And how many will end up in the next gang that moves in? Roberts asked with a cynicism born of experience. Because someone will. There's too much money to be made. She wasn't wrong. Already there were reports of a new county line filling the vacuum left by the Frank line's collapse, this one called the Fury Line, again named after a boxer, again recruiting children to run its operations. After leaving the prison, I drove to the Netherthorpe estate, parking near the entrance to Ponderosa Park. In the 6 months since Kareem's murder, little had changed here. The same concrete walkways, the same tower blocks, the same sense of abandonment by the systems meant to protect and nurture. I walked the path that Kareem had taken on his final night, trying to see it through his eyes. What had he been thinking as he approached the meeting with Roberts? Was he suspicious, cautious, or just focused on making another sale, earning money in the only way he knew how? The spot where he fell was unmarked, no memorial, no flowers, just a patch of grass like any other. But I could still see it in my mind's eye. The body, the blood, the evidence markers. Another young life ended too soon in a cycle of violence that seemed endless. As I stood there, a group of teenagers walked past, no more than 14 or 15 years old. They glanced at me suspiciously. A middle-aged man in plain clothes had to be either a cop or a competitor. I watched them continue down the path, heads together, talking animatedly, and wondered which of them would be the next Trent Wilson or Mason Kelly. Which would be the next Kareem Adams? The case was closed. Justice of a sort had been served, but the conditions that had created the tragedy remained unaddressed, and that perhaps was the greatest failure of all. Let me ask you something. If you were in my position, standing in that park where a young man died, watching another generation potentially heading down the same path, what would you do? How do you break a cycle that's fueled by poverty, lack of opportunity, and systematic neglect? Because until we answer that question, there will always be another Frank Line, another Kareem Adams, another pair of teenage killers like Wilson and Kelly. The moral of the story, as I stand here today looking back on the case of Kareem Adams and the Frank Line, I find myself contemplating not just what we accomplished, but what we failed to address. Yes, we dismantled a drug network. Yes, we brought killers to justice. But did we really solve the underlying problem? I don't think we did. The true lesson of this case isn't about drug gangs or murder investigations. It's about how our society creates the conditions for these tragedies to occur again and again in an endless cycle. It's about children like Trent Wilson and Mason Kelly, who at 17 and 16 became killers because a drug gang offered them what society couldn't or wouldn't: a sense of belonging, purpose, and financial opportunity, however twisted and destructive. It's about young men like Kareem Adams, who saw dealing drugs as his best option for making a living in a community with limited legitimate prospects. It's about women like Vanessa Roberts, trapped in cycles of addiction and debt that drove her to participate in something she knew was wrong. And it's about men like Vincent Cole and Leonard Mathers, who saw an opportunity to profit from the desperation of others and built an empire on the backs of children and the bodies of rivals. The moral, if there is one, is that true justice can't be achieved solely through arrests and convictions. It requires addressing the social conditions that breed crime and violence in the first place: poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, inadequate support for vulnerable children and families. As I near the end of my career in law enforcement, I find myself wondering more and more about prevention rather than punishment. What if we invested as much in youth centers, education, mental health services, and addiction treatment as we do in prisons and police? What if we created legitimate opportunities in communities like Netherthorpe that could compete with the false promises of drug gangs? I don't have all the answers, but I know that until we start asking these questions and acting on them, there will always be another Frank Line. There will always be more children recruited into violence, more lives lost, more families shattered. If you're watching this and thinking it's someone else's problem, I urge you to reconsider. This affects all of us: the safety of our communities, the futures of our children, the kind of society we want to build. The drug networks that exploit vulnerable kids don't stay confined to those neighborhoods. Their poison spreads everywhere, touching lives across all social boundaries. So what can you do? Get involved in youth mentoring programs. Support organizations working with at-risk children. Advocate for better funding for education and social services in disadvantaged communities. Vote for policies that address inequality and create opportunity. Be the kind of neighbor who notices when a child is struggling and reaches out instead of looking away. And perhaps most importantly, share this story, not for its shock value, but for its lessons about the real costs of our collective failures and the urgent need to do better. If this account helps even one person understand the complex roots of youth violence and drug crime, if it moves even one community to take action, then perhaps Kareem's death won't have been entirely in vain. If you found value in this story, if it's made you think or challenged your perspectives, please subscribe to our channel. We're committed to exploring these difficult issues, to seeking understanding rather than sensation, and to contributing to real solutions. In my years as a detective, I've learned that the most important question isn't always who did it, but why did they do it? And more importantly, how can we prevent it from happening again? That's the question I leave with you today. Thank you for listening to the story of Kareem Adams, Trent Wilson, Mason Kelly, and the Frank Line. May we learn from their tragedy and work toward a future where such stories become increasingly rare.